The emergency HOA meeting was already packed when Karen Whitmore lifted a stack of papers and insisted the lien on Cedar Ridge Ranch was lawful. Ethan Walker, she said, had simply refused to pay what he owed. Then the rear doors opened. Claire Bennett from Westbridge Title and Escrow stepped inside carrying 2 document boxes, followed by rows of elderly homeowners. She placed one file in front of Karen, then another, then another. 48 liens. One belonged to Ethan. 47 belonged to people who had never known they shared the same problem. And everyone contained the same impossible detail. If you enjoy stories where ordinary people stay calm, follow the evidence, and force powerful people to answer for what they put on paper, subscribe to the channel. What happened in Pine Ridge began with one blocked land sale, but it would end with 48 property records, a missing set of files, and a question Karen had spent years making sure no one asked. 3 weeks earlier, Cedar Ridge Ranch had looked exactly the way Ethan Walker wanted it to look. Quiet, useful, and almost invisible from the road. The ranch had been in his family for years. It sat beyond the eastern edge of Pine Ridge, a polished subdivision of stone entry signs, trimmed lawns, decorative ponds, and an HOA that seemed to issue a new rule every month. Ethan had never cared what Pine Ridge did inside Pine Ridge. He had no interest in its landscaping committees, pool schedules, architectural approvals, or arguments over mailbox colors. His position had always been simple. Their rules stopped where his fence began. The land itself mattered more to him than any dispute with neighbors. The western fields were still used for grazing. An old equipment barn stood near the creek. The eastern side, where the pasture flattened toward the county road, had become more valuable as development moved closer. For years, Ethan refused every suggestion that he carve it up. Then a local family approached him about buying a modest parcel along the eastern boundary. They wanted enough acreage for a house, a workshop, and room for 2 horses. They were not developers. They were not representing Pine Ridge. Ethan liked that. The transaction was ordinary enough that nobody expected trouble. There was a signed purchase agreement. A survey had been ordered. The parcel number matched the county map. The buyer had financing. A closing date had been placed on the calendar. Westbridge Title and Escrow was hired to perform the title search and ensure the transfer. Claire Bennett, a senior title examiner who had spent years looking for the kinds of defects most people never knew existed, pulled the public record the same way she had done hundreds of times before. Her call to Ethan came just after lunch. "We found an encumbrance," she said. Ethan was standing beside a workbench in the barn when he heard the word. "What kind?" "An HOA assessment lien." He waited, assuming she had the wrong parcel. Claire read the legal description. It was his land. The lien had been recorded almost 8 months earlier. The amount claimed was $86,400. The creditor listed on the document was Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. Ethan set down the wrench in his hand. "That ranch is not in Pine Ridge. I understand that's your position," Claire said. "But the lien is in the county record, which means I can't ignore it. Until we know why it's there and whether it's valid, I can't clear title for closing." Ethan drove to Westbridge that afternoon, carrying a folder thick with documents he had kept for years. The original deed was inside. So were old surveys, tax statements, boundary plats, correspondence from the county, and several letters from Pine Ridge that he had never thrown away because they involved access roads and drainage easements near the subdivision. He laid the deed on Claire's desk and pointed to the legal description. "No covenant," he said. "No annexation. No membership agreement. I've never paid Pine Ridge $1. Claire turned her monitor toward him. "That's why this caught my attention." The recorded lien looked professional at first glance. It had a county recording stamp, a parcel identifier, legal language, a notary block, an assessment history, and a line claiming that the owner had acknowledged HOA jurisdiction. At the bottom was a signature. Ethan leaned closer. It looked like his, not vaguely like his, not a clumsy imitation. The slant was right. The long stroke on the W was right. Even the shortened loop forint he used when signing quickly was there. But Ethan had never signed the document. His attention moved to the sentence above it. Owner acknowledged HOA jurisdiction pursuant to Community Infrastructure Participation Agreement. "I've never heard of that agreement," he said. Claire opened the county image linked to the lien. They attached a reference number to 1. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not threaten Karen. He did not call the HOA office. He simply asked Claire to print everything the county showed. What bothered him most was not the $86,400. Money could be argued. Fees could be challenged. The signature meant someone had tried to make a dispute look like consent. Claire magnified the page. "There's something else," she said. She pointed to the execution date. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before remembering exactly where he had been. On the date the document claimed he had signed and acknowledged HOA jurisdiction, he had been 2 counties away at a livestock auction, a fact supported by receipts, an electronic payment, and a delivery record timestamped that afternoon. The first thing Claire told Ethan the next morning was not to confront Karen yet. "If this is a mistake, we document the mistake," she said. "If it isn't a mistake, we still document it. Either way, we don't start with accusations, we start with what can be proved." That suited Ethan. Together they began with boundaries. The county plat showed Cedar Ridge outside Pine Ridge. The current survey showed the same thing. The tax map agreed. The recorded declaration for Pine Ridge identified the subdivision lots subject to the HOA covenants, and Ethan's parcel was not among them. No amendment Claire could locate added the ranch. That should have ended the jurisdiction question, but the lien anticipated the problem. It cited a separate document called a Community Infrastructure Participation Agreement. According to its language, Ethan had voluntarily agreed to contribute toward road maintenance, security, drainage, and community infrastructure because his property supposedly benefited from Pine Ridge improvements. Claire requested a certified copy directly from the county recorder rather than relying on the PDF associated with the HOA filing. When it arrived, the defects did not appear all at once. They appeared one by one, which made them worse. The signature was the first problem. Claire searched older public filings bearing Ethan's name and found a county permit application from years earlier. The signature on that permit was nearly identical to the one on the participation agreement, not merely similar in handwriting. Several tiny irregularities appeared in exactly the same places. The notary block was the second problem. The notary's name belonged to a real person, but the commission number formatting did not match the format used during the date shown on the agreement. Claire would not call that proof of fraud by itself, but it was enough to verify further. The legal description was the third problem. One measurement had been copied from an obsolete survey that predated a corrected boundary filing. The current legal description in Ethan's deed used the updated figure. Someone preparing a genuine agreement with Ethan's current records should have used the corrected version. The mailing address created a fourth problem. Pine Ridge claimed multiple notices had been sent before the lien was recorded, yet the address on the assessment file omitted the mailbox designation Ethan had used for years. Claire asked for proof of certified delivery. Nothing came back. Ethan pulled out the folder of old Pine Ridge correspondence. One letter stood out. 6 months earlier, Karen Whitmore had written to him in her capacity as HOA president, proposing that Pine Ridge purchase the same eastern acreage Ethan now intended to sell. The letter described the parcel as strategically useful for expanded amenities, a possible service access route, and future drainage improvements. Ethan had declined. 2 months later, according to the county record, the participation agreement he had never signed suddenly existed. Claire placed the dates beside each other. Offer to buy land, refusal, alleged agreement, assessment, Lien. Ethan studied the timeline and said, "That gives us motive. It doesn't prove who made the paper." Claire nodded. "Exactly." She returned to the lien and examined its recording code. Her expression changed. "What?" Ethan asked. "I've seen this formatting before." She searched an internal reference database from a prior title file, then ran a public record search using a combination of the document language and return address. Another property appeared, different owner, different street. Same HOA, same style of lien. Ethan sent Pine Ridge a formal written request that afternoon. He asked for the original Community Infrastructure Participation Agreement, the board vote authorizing the assessment, a complete calculation of the $86,400, notice history, proof of delivery, lien authorization, and contact information for HOA counsel. He kept the request short and specific. Karen did not email the records. 2 days later, she drove to Cedar Ridge herself. She arrived in a dark SUV with 2 board members and a thick binder tucked under one arm. Karen was dressed as if she were walking into a closing she already controlled. Tailored jacket, polished shoes, hair set perfectly, expression composed. She greeted Ethan with the clipped patience of someone who believed the meeting existed only to make him accept something. "This has gone much farther than necessary," she said. "The association is prepared to resolve it privately." Ethan stood near the ranch office door. "Where is the original agreement?" Karen opened the binder and turned to a photocopy. "The original," Ethan repeated. "Our records are maintained electronically. Who witnessed my signature?" Karen flipped to an assessment ledger. "You've benefited from Pine Ridge infrastructure for years. Road maintenance, stormwater improvements, security patrols. This is not a new obligation." "That wasn't my question." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Karen's smile tightened. Ethan had set his phone on the railing with the camera visible. He told Karen he was recording the conversation on his property. Then he asked 4 questions, slowly enough that there could be no confusion. Does Pine Ridge claim the signature on that agreement is mine? Yes. Does Pine Ridge claim my ranch is subject to the assessment? Yes. Did you authorize the lien process as HOA president? I authorize enforcement of valid obligations. Do you have proof that notice was delivered before the lien was recorded? For the first time, Karen did not answer immediately. The association followed its procedures, she said. That's not proof of delivery. Karen moved back to the ledger. The page broke the $86,400 into principal assessments, late penalties, enforcement charges, administrative costs, and legal fees. The totals climbed in neat blocks that looked more like spreadsheet formulas than invoices. Ethan asked to see the attorney bills supporting the legal fees. Karen did not have them. Then she changed tactics. If you want your closing to proceed, she said, the board is willing to accept $41,000 as a good faith settlement provided payment is received within 72 hours. Ethan looked at her. You're saying I legally owe $86,400, but you'll take $41,000 by Friday? That is the board's attempt to avoid unnecessary expense. If the debt is valid, why does it lose more than half its value while we're standing on my porch? Karen closed the binder halfway. Because reasonable people settle disputes. She handed him a printed settlement agreement. Ethan did not sign it. He read the first page, then the second, then the payment instructions. At the bottom was the name of a company he had never seen before. Community Compliance Resolution LLC, not Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. Ethan folded the copy once and kept it. That evening, Claire called. The second lien she had found had already been released months earlier. The homeowner had apparently paid a settlement, and the release document named the same company Karen had just put on Ethan's porch, Community Compliance Resolution LLC. Claire did not search the next morning for Karen's name. Names could change. Vendors could change. People could deny knowing one another. Patterns in documents were harder to hide. She searched the recording language, notary name, return address, settlement instructions, document template, and filing sequence. The first expanded search produced 7 liens. A broader date range produced 19. When she included liens that had already been released, the number rose to 31. Then she added one more variation of the vendor name. 48 properties appeared. Claire checked the list twice before calling Ethan. One of them is yours, she said. The other 47 belonged to other owners. Ethan drove to Westbridge and found Claire standing beside a printer that seemed unable to stop. Page after page came out. Parcel numbers, owner names, filing dates, claim balances, releases, and notices. The names changed, the structure barely did. Most cases followed the same progression. A relatively small assessment appeared first. Late fees accumulated quickly. A lien was recorded. The owner received language warning about collection or possible foreclosure. Then, before the claimed balance reached its full amount, someone offered a discounted settlement if payment was made quickly. In several cases, the release was recorded only after money went to Community Compliance Resolution LLC. The pattern was not limited to large debts. Some homeowners had paid a few $1,000s. Others had paid far more. The amounts were different enough to look individualized, but the process was remarkably consistent. Claire began building a spreadsheet for the title company's fraud unit. Owner, property filing date, amount, notary, vendor, release, settlement evidence, notice timing. A demographic pattern emerged almost by accident. Many owners were older. Several lived alone. Others were retired couples who had been in their homes for decades. Many owned substantial equity because their mortgages were nearly paid off or gone. They were exactly the kind of owners who would fear any document suggesting their home could be tied up in a legal process, yet might decide that paying a settlement was cheaper and less frightening than hiring counsel. Ethan stared at the list. This is the point where we have to be careful, Claire said. 48 similar records are not the same as proving 48 fraudulent liens. Ethan nodded. Then prove the pattern before we accuse anybody. That sentence changed how Westbridge handled the file. Claire formally escalated the matter to underwriting and internal fraud review. Certified copies were ordered where necessary. Emails were preserved with original metadata. Settlement letters were scanned. Public filings were downloaded and logged. Nobody altered the documents to make them easier to understand. The source of each record mattered as much as what it said. On Claire's screen, the files began to look less like legal paperwork and more like a repeating sequence. Parcel owner Lien, pressure settlement, release, parcel owner Lien, pressure settlement, release, different households, same machinery. Then Ethan recognized a name, Margaret Hale. She lived 3 miles from Cedar Ridge in a small brick house with white shutters and a maple tree that shaded most of the front yard. Ethan knew her because she had bought hay from his family years earlier when her husband still kept 2 horses. Since her husband's death, Margaret mostly kept to herself. The previous year she had mentioned, almost apologetically, that she had needed to pull money from savings because of a problem with the HOA. Ethan had assumed it was a roof assessment or some expensive neighborhood project. Now he knew there had been a lien. Margaret was 76. When Ethan and Claire visited, she invited them into a dining room, where the table had been covered with a plastic protector for so long that its edges had yellowed. She listened without interrupting, while Claire explained that they were reviewing recorded liens connected to Pine Ridge. Then Margaret stood, walked to a hall closet, and returned carrying a cardboard box. "I kept all of it," she said. Inside were envelopes, notices, handwritten phone notes, a payment receipt, a settlement letter, and a release document. Margaret had organized them by date because, as she put it, she had been afraid someone would ask her to prove she had paid. The first notice claimed she owed $18,730. Margaret remembered the number without looking. "I thought they had made a mistake," she said. The first amount they ever talked about was only a few thousand. The rest had been described as penalties, collection costs, legal review, enforcement fees, and recording expenses. She called the HOA office. The woman who answered told her the matter had progressed beyond routine collections. If she did not resolve it within 10 days, the property could enter a foreclosure process. Margaret's voice lowered when she repeated that phrase. "I didn't tell my daughter," she said. "I thought she would think I couldn't handle my own bills anymore." For several days, Margaret barely slept. She had lived in the house for more than 30 years. Her husband had spent most of his working life paying it off. She imagined a court notice on the door. She imagined neighbors watching. She imagined having to explain that she had somehow lost control of the one thing they had always believed was safe. After several calls, the HOA offered to settle for $9,800 if she paid quickly. Margaret transferred the money. The lien was released. She told nobody. Claire opened the settlement letter and read the payment instructions. Community Compliance Resolution LLC. The same name was there again. Margaret also had something Claire did not expect. An old voicemail saved on her phone. Karen's voice was calm, almost reassuring. She said the discounted settlement would remain available for 48 hours and encouraged Margaret to avoid additional enforcement expense. There was no shouting, no explicit threat. That made the recording more unsettling, not less. Karen sounded like someone explaining a routine procedure that Margaret had no practical choice but to accept. Claire asked permission to preserve a copy. Margaret agreed. The next week turned numbers into people. Ethan and Claire spoke with a retired couple whose refinance had stalled because of a lien they did not understand. They met a man who had delayed replacing a leaking roof because he used the money to clear an HOA claim. One woman discovered the lien only when she tried to add her daughter to the title. Another owner paid a settlement without ever learning what the original assessment supposedly funded. Every story had different details. The emotional pattern was the same. Each person had thought the problem belonged only to them. That isolation had helped the system work. Margaret sat in on one of the meetings at Westbridge. She watched Claire add another verified owner to the spreadsheet. "How many of us are there?" Margaret asked. Ethan looked at Claire. 47 besides him, Claire said. Margaret absorbed that quietly. Then she looked at the columns on the screen. "Then stop calling us cases," she said. "Call us." That sentence changed the investigation in a different way. The title company still treated every property separately for legal purposes, but Ethan and Claire began contacting the owners who consented to be reached. People compared letters. They brought envelopes. They found receipts tucked inside desk drawers. They forwarded old emails they had once been too embarrassed to show anyone. One envelope became critical. The HOA had repeatedly claimed that owners received notice before liens were recorded. But the postmark on this envelope was dated 4 days after the corresponding lien had already entered the county record. Claire set the envelope beside the certified lien. The dates could not both support Karen's story. Someone had recorded first and warned later, at least once. And if it had happened once, Claire now had a reason to check every case where an original envelope still existed. The investigation moved next from signatures and notices to money. Claire's fraud team did not have subpoena power. They could not open private bank accounts because they were curious. They worked with what the owners had voluntarily provided and what was publicly available. Canceled checks, card statements, payment receipts, settlement letters, HOA budgets, corporate registrations, vendor disclosures, and board minutes. Community Compliance Resolution LLC had been formed not long before the earliest lien in the group. Its mailing address was a small commercial suite used by multiple businesses. Its corporate description called it a provider of community compliance and document resolution services. Pine Ridge budgets listed payments to the company under legal and collection services. But Community Client Complaint Resolution was not a law firm. That discrepancy drew the attention of Robert Ellis, the HOA treasurer. Robert contacted Ethan carefully, insisting at first that he was not accusing Karen of anything. He said the board had approved the use of a vendor to assist with delinquent accounts, but he had never been presented with a list of 48 liens. Karen, he explained, often placed vendor expenses inside consent agendas. Routine items were grouped together and approved in one vote unless a board member pulled something for discussion. "You signed the budgets," Ethan said. Robert did not argue. "I did." "Then I need more than you telling me you didn't know." Robert looked embarrassed, but Ethan's point was clear. If Karen's word required verification, Robert's did too. Ethan asked for minutes, invoices, authorizations, and the vendor agreement. Robert produced what he could access without altering anything. The records showed something strange. Several invoices from Community Compliance Resolution used amounts that matched, down to the dollar, legal fees later charged inside individual liens. Yet there were no corresponding attorney invoices attached to explain those legal charges. Claire compared the numbers across cases. The proven settlements among owners who still had documentation already exceeded $100,000. That was not the total amount demanded. It was not even the total amount paid. It was merely the amount they could verify from the records currently in hand. Then the corporate filings produced another name, Linda Mercer. Linda was listed as the original organizer of Community Compliance Resolution LLC. She was not a Pine Ridge board member. Her name meant nothing to Claire. It meant something to Ethan. He had seen it on an old piece of HOA correspondence involving administrative services near the Eastern Access Road. Linda had managed another company that had previously provided back-office support to Pine Ridge. The question grew larger. Had Karen built the entire arrangement herself? Was she using a vendor that had gone far beyond its authority? Or was the vendor part of the plan from the beginning? One invoice made the issue harder to dismiss. Among ordinary phrases about processing, mailing, and account review was a line item that read, "Signature processing record preparation." Ethan read it twice. "Signature processing?" he asked. Claire did not speculate. "We preserve the invoice. We ask what that means." Before they could ask, the company began disappearing. Claire's team prepared a preservation request for electronic materials connected to the lien files. That afternoon, the vendor website was active. By evening, several pages returned errors. The following morning, the site was gone. Hours later, Pine Ridge residents received an email from Karen. False allegations, it said, were being spread against the HOA by parties attempting to interfere with valid association rights. Karen knew someone was looking. And instead of producing the original agreement Ethan had requested, she had begun defending the system as a whole. Karen called an emergency board meeting 2 nights later. Her email to residents described Ethan as a landowner seeking development advantage by pressuring Pine Ridge to surrender legitimate claims. She accused unnamed outsiders of misreading records, contacting residents improperly, and creating unnecessary fear. The message never used the word fraud. It treated the entire dispute as a public relations problem. A cease and desist letter arrived at Cedar Ridge the next morning. It demanded that Ethan stop making statements that could damage the HOA's reputation. Ethan did not post it online. He did not write a response for the neighborhood forum. He did not drive to Karen's house. He forwarded the letter to Claire and to counsel assisting with the title dispute. Then Karen made a mistake that no one needed to interpret. In a written message to the membership, she stated, "Every owner received notice before recording." Claire printed the sentence. Beside it, she placed the original envelope with the postmark dated after the lien. Karen was no longer merely saying the process was proper. She had made a factual claim capable of being tested. The pressure continued. One older homeowner, who had already paid a settlement, received a new notice demanding a remaining balance. That suggested the collection process had not stopped despite the growing dispute. Then a board member privately told Robert that Karen had instructed staff to move older records, clean up the shared drive, and standardize meeting minutes so files were easier to review. That language could have been innocent. It could also have been catastrophic if files were deleted or changed. Ethan did not enter the HOA office to protect anything himself. Council sent formal preservation notices. Westbridge documented the information it had received. The county recorder was notified that multiple instruments were under review. For a few hours, Ethan thought the immediate problem might finally ease. The recorder's office flagged his lien for review. He called Claire. "Does that clear the closing?" "No." The answer was immediate. "A flag is not a release," she said. "The instrument is still in the chain. We still have to resolve how the insurer will handle it." The buyer's lender would hold the financing for only 10 more days. That changed the meaning of every delay. Karen did not need to win a lawsuit. She did not need to prove the $86,400. If she could keep the lien alive long enough for the buyer's financing to expire, the transaction could collapse. Then she could argue that the dispute had caused no completed sale damage, because there was no sale left to damage. Ethan stood in the ranch office, looking at the closing calendar pinned above his desk. "She's using time," he said. Claire nodded. "Then we document time too." 2 days later, just before dusk, Claire received a call from a woman named Sarah Cole. Sarah had once worked as an administrative coordinator for Pine Ridge. She refused to explain much over the phone. She asked whether Claire was reviewing the recorded liens. "Yes. You're looking at the wrong end," Sarah said. "What do you mean? You're looking at the liens. You need to look at the signatures." Sarah agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop outside Pine Ridge the next morning. She arrived with no dramatic folder, no stolen hard drive, and no claim that she had personally watched Karen forge anything. Claire appreciated that. Witnesses became more useful when they described what they actually knew instead of what they assumed. Sarah had worked for Pine Ridge for almost 4 years. Her job included preparing meeting packets, maintaining owner correspondence, scanning documents, and sending approved materials to outside vendors. During her final year, she noticed a change in how delinquency files were handled. Karen began asking staff to collect signatures from older records, not new signatures, existing ones, owner applications, architectural requests, parking forms, pool agreements. Anything with a clear signature block was scanned into folders organized by address. Sarah had once asked why. Karen told her it was for administrative convenience so the HOA could verify owner identity across systems. "At the time, that sounded possible," Sarah said. "But then I saw the folder." "What folder?" Claire asked. Sarah looked around the coffee shop before answering. "Ready to Wrecker." The shared drive contained a directory with that name. Inside were PDFs labeled by property address. Sarah did not open every file, but she saw drafts of liens, releases, affidavits, and owner-related forms. When Karen wanted a delinquency matter advanced, staff would prepare materials and send them to Community Compliance Resolution. Sarah no longer had access to the system. She had left Pine Ridge months earlier after a disagreement about record keeping. But she still possessed one email she had sent to her personal account after becoming worried that board minutes did not match the timing of documents she was being asked to process. She had not copied an entire database. She had preserved one message. The attachment was a draft lien. Claire opened the file on a laptop while Sarah watched. The property belonged to one of the 47 owners already identified. The PDF creation date preceded the board meeting at which the minutes claimed the enforcement action had been authorized. Ethan looked at the dates. So the lien was prepared before the board supposedly voted on it. "At least this one was," Claire said. That distinction mattered. Claire compared the draft with the recorded version. The layout was nearly identical. The legal language matched, the return address matched. What changed were the date, claimed amount, and signature area. Sarah described another pattern. Karen often asked which homeowners lived alone, which rarely attended meetings, and which had been in their properties the longest. Sarah had assumed Karen wanted to identify residents who needed extra outreach. Now the questions sounded different. "Did she ever say those people were easier to collect from?" Ethan asked. "No," Sarah said. "I'm not going to say she did. She asked for the information. That's what I know." Ethan nodded. "That's enough." The material went through the proper channels. Westbridge's fraud unit documented Sarah's statement. The county recorder review team received authenticated copies of the relevant filings. Council passed the information to investigators who could legally obtain server records, access logs, original documents, and vendor communications. No one rushed to Karen's house with handcuffs. That frustrated some residents when word of the investigation began spreading. Margaret asked why an obviously disputed lien could remain on a record while everyone waited for procedure. Claire explained it carefully. Because if a false document gets into the public record, removing it carelessly can create another problem. We need a correction that survives scrutiny. Not just for Ethan, for everyone. Ethan understood. The same thing that made official paperwork dangerous made proper corrections slow. A public record could not be treated like a social media post someone deleted when challenged. Then the notary verification arrived. The woman whose name appeared on multiple documents was real. She had held a valid commission during part of the relevant period, but she denied notarizing the signatures in question. Investigators compared dates. On at least one of the supposed notarizations, travel records placed her in another state. Claire called Ethan into her office and showed him the confirmation. For the first time since the lien appeared, the room went silent for more than a few seconds. A disputed signature could be blamed on memory. A notice problem could be blamed on mail. A board date could be blamed on sloppy minutes. But a notary whose identity appeared on a document she said she never notarized moved the case into a different category. Claire closed the file. "We have enough to stop treating these as isolated title defects," she said. The owners agreed to attend a special Pine Ridge meeting the following week. Karen prepared the community room the way she always had. Board table in front, microphone centered, printed agenda. 2-minute speaking limit posted near the entrance. Her chair sat slightly higher than the folding chairs arranged for residents. She opened the meeting by stating that the board would not tolerate disruption and that individual account matters could not be combined into what she called a group accusation. Then the doors opened. Margaret entered, first carrying her cardboard file box. Behind her came couples holding binders, widows clutching envelopes, retired homeowners with certified copies, and several adult children accompanying parents who had finally told them what had happened. Some had paid settlements, some still had liens. Others had only recently learned their property records had ever contained one. Ethan walked in near the back. Claire and 2 Westbridge representatives carried document boxes. Karen's expression changed only slightly, but Robert saw it. She had expected complaints. She had not expected organization. When public comment began, Karen tried to separate each owner. "Your account will be reviewed individually. This matter is unrelated to the previous speaker. Please do not discuss another homeowner's confidential balance." Claire waited until the board allowed her to speak about the title issues affecting the pending transaction. She did not accuse Karen of stealing. She did not call the HOA criminal. She placed certified copies on the table in a row. "Different owners," she said. "Same document language. Another row, same vendor. Another, same notary pattern." She showed fee categories, settlement instructions, recording anomalies, and duplicated language that appeared across files supposedly created for different circumstances. Karen leaned toward the microphone. "That may demonstrate a vendor template. It does not demonstrate wrongdoing by this board." Claire slid the vendor contract forward. Karen's signature appeared on it. "The vendor was approved," Karen said. Robert opened the minutes binder. "Not for this," he said. Karen turned toward him. Robert continued. "The board approved collection support. I cannot find authorization for a program producing this number of recorded liens, or for the fees being charged this way." "You approved the budgets," Karen said sharply. "Yes," Robert replied. "And I should have asked more questions." That answer took some of the force out of her attack because he did not pretend to be innocent of negligence. Karen tried another route. Every affected owner received notice before recording. Margaret stood. She walked to the front without raising her voice and placed an envelope beside the certified lien from another owner who had authorized its use. Claire pointed to the dates. Lien recorded Monday. Envelope postmarked Friday. Karen stared at the envelope. "That could be a follow-up notice." "Then produce the earlier one," Ethan said from the second row. Karen looked at him but did not answer. Margaret remained standing. "My husband and I paid for our house over 30 years, she said. "When I got your notice, I thought I had done something stupid. I thought I had missed a bill. I thought if I told my daughter, she would decide I couldn't handle my own affairs anymore." Nobody interrupted her. "You told me I could avoid more enforcement if I paid quickly." "So I did. I used money we had saved because I believed the paper in front of me meant you could take the house." Karen shifted toward the microphone. "Mrs. Hale, I understand that collections can be stressful." Margaret stopped her with one question. "How many people did you expect to stay quiet because we were embarrassed?" A murmur moved through the room. Then one man stood and held up his settlement letter. Another woman raised a release document. A retired couple placed a canceled check on the table. For years, each homeowner had been alone with a problem that seemed too technical, too shameful, or too expensive to fight. In that room, the isolation disappeared. Claire opened the first document box. Then the second, 48 property files. One for Ethan Walker, 47 for the others. It was the scene Karen would later claim had been designed to humiliate her. But no one needed theatrics. The documents created the pressure by themselves. HOA counsel finally stood and whispered to Karen. He announced that the association disputed several characterizations being made, that legal review was underway, and that Karen would not answer additional questions that evening. Karen gathered her binder and left through the side door. A security camera in the hallway caught what happened next. She pulled out her phone before reaching the parking lot. The audio was faint but clear enough once preserved. "They found the old files," Karen said. The sentence lasted only a few seconds. It created a new problem for her. No one in the meeting had mentioned old files. The buyer's financing deadline was now less than 24 hours away when another filing hit Ethan's property record. Claire saw it late in the afternoon. Her first thought was that Pine Ridge had finally recorded a release. It had not. The document was an amended lien. It added fees, restated the claim that Ethan had accepted HOA jurisdiction, and asserted that enforcement had begun before he disputed the debt. If accepted at face value, it could complicate the title company's proposed solution and force another round of review just as the buyer's financing expired. Claire checked the document line by line. Same notary identity, same vendor language, same participation agreement already under dispute, same basic structure as the earlier records. Karen, or someone acting through the HOA process, was trying to strengthen the lien with the same materials investigators were already examining. Ethan received Claire's call while closing a gate on the east pasture. He listened, then asked, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing except availability. Don't contact Karen. I wasn't planning to." Claire notified counsel. The recorder's office received the preservation information and the dispute documentation. Investigators were alerted to the new filing because its timing mattered. At almost the same time, a Pine Ridge resident sent Robert a security clip from the HOA office parking area. After business hours, Karen and another person were carrying boxes from the building to an SUV. A desktop computer tower appeared in one of the trips. The resident wanted Ethan to come over. Ethan refused. "Do not touch the boxes," he said. "Do not follow the car. Preserve the footage." Those 3 instructions prevented a bad situation from becoming worse. Nobody blocked Karen's vehicle. Nobody tried to seize HOA property. Nobody created an argument she could later use to claim intimidation. The footage went to counsel and then to investigators. By then, the evidence no longer depended on one suspicious lien. There were disputed signatures, a notary denial, inconsistent notice dates, vendor payments, board authorization questions, disappearing web pages, a witness who remembered signature folders, and video of records being moved after preservation demands. The proper authorities obtained legal access to materials that residents themselves could not touch. What they found was less dramatic than a written confession and far more useful. There were template folders organized by property, scanned owner signatures, settlement spreadsheets, fee calculations, communications with community compliance resolution, draft recording packets, versions of documents saved at different times. One spreadsheet contained a column that investigators initially thought was a collection priority score. The heading read, "Likelihood to contest." Some names were marked high, others medium. A striking number of older homeowners were marked low. Margaret Hale was one of them. Ethan stared at the column when Claire showed him an authorized summary of the discovery. He did not ask what low meant. Nobody needed to explain it. The next morning, Westbridge received the documentation its underwriters needed to handle the disputed lien and proceed with the protected transaction according to the legal mechanism available in the file. The county record issue was not magically erased. It was addressed in a way the title insurer could defend. The closing began before the buyer's financing deadline. Ethan sat across from the family buying the eastern parcel. He signed the deed, transfer documents, and final settlement papers. The buyer smiled with the exhausted relief of someone who had spent 3 weeks wondering whether a perfectly ordinary land purchase would disappear because of a debt nobody understood. Ethan reached for the final page. Claire, seated at the end of the table, said quietly, "Your closing is fixed. The other 47 aren't." Ethan stopped with the pen above the paper. For him, the immediate fight could have ended there. The land sale was going through. The lien no longer controlled the transaction. He could have handed the remaining problem to lawyers and gone back to the ranch. He signed the page. Then he closed the folder. "Then we finished the other 47. The closing did not end the investigation. It removed the deadline Karen had been using against Ethan, and that changed the balance immediately. Until that morning, every decision had been made with a clock running in the background. Now the title company, the affected owners, the board, and investigators could examine the records without wondering whether one more delay would destroy Ethan's sale. The first task was separating 48 connected files into 48 individual property histories. Similarity had revealed the pattern, but each owner still needed a clean answer about his or her own title. Claire's team built a chronology for every address: when an assessment first appeared, when notice was supposedly sent, when a lien entered the public record, when settlement was offered, when payment was made, and whether a release followed. Some files collapsed quickly under review. A claimed authorization had no matching board action. A notice date was impossible. A legal description did not match the current deed. A notary block could not be authenticated. Other files required more work because part of the underlying assessment was real, even though later fees or enforcement documents were disputed. Claire refused to describe all 47 owners as identical victims merely because that made the story simpler. That's how bad records survive, she told Ethan. People stop separating what they can prove from what they want to prove. Ethan agreed. For owners with unsupported liens, the process moved toward formal challenge, correction, or release through the procedures available to them. For people who had already paid settlements, lawyers began assembling restitution claims using receipts, canceled checks, correspondence, and the recovered vendor records. Some owners had kept almost everything. Others had thrown away letters because seeing them made them anxious. The recovered spreadsheets filled some gaps, but no one pretended missing evidence could be invented. Margaret's file was among the strongest. Her original envelope, saved voicemail, payment receipt, settlement letter, and release created a nearly continuous timeline. She had once been embarrassed by the fact that she kept every scrap of paper. Now those scraps explained exactly how $9,800 left her savings. The Pine Ridge Board changed faster than anyone expected. Robert Ellis requested an independent audit and publicly acknowledged that the board's oversight had failed. He did not blame every questionable action on Karen. He admitted that directors had approved consent agendas without demanding enough backup, accepted broad descriptions of collection expenses, and allowed one office to control too much of the record-keeping process. Several residents were angry with him. "You were treasurer," one man said at a meeting. "How did you not see this?" Robert answered without hiding behind procedure. "I saw totals. I did not insist on seeing what was underneath them. That was my failure." The answer did not erase responsibility, but it mattered because the investigation was beginning to distinguish negligence from intentional conduct. Not every board member had known how the liens were being prepared. Not every employee understood what the signature files might be used for. Some people had been careless. Some had trusted Karen too much. Some had noticed things and said nothing, because challenging the president seemed harder than approving another agenda. Karen lost access to financial systems and association records while the review continued. The board appointed temporary administrators and required two-person approval for sensitive filings. Collection activity connected to the disputed process stopped. Residents who had spent years receiving stern letters suddenly received notices telling them not to make additional payments until their accounts were reviewed. Community Compliance Resolution LLC could no longer hide behind the small print at the bottom of settlement pages. Investigators and auditors compared its invoices with HOA payments, owner settlements, filing packets, and recovered communications. They worked backward through the process. Who supplied owner data? Who selected accounts? Who prepared draft documents? Who inserted signatures? Who chose the notary information? Who calculated the fees? Who transmitted liens for recording? Who received settlement money? Who approved releases? The answers did not belong to one dramatic confession. They existed in timestamps, access logs, email chains, invoice numbers, and document versions. That was exactly why Ethan had resisted confronting Karen on the first day. Had the dispute become a shouting match over one fake-looking signature, the larger system might never have been preserved long enough to understand. Linda Mercer, whose name appeared on the vendor's original corporate filing, was required to explain the company's role. The records showed repeated administrative coordination between the vendor and Pine Ridge, including preparation of recording packets and settlement processing. Investigators then compared those communications with Karen's approvals and the board's actual minutes. The gaps between what the board had authorized and what had been done became impossible to dismiss as routine shorthand. Karen continued denying that she had intended to take anyone's home. Her position was that Pine Ridge was collecting legitimate obligations and that outside contractors were responsible for document preparation. But the question was no longer whether she personally typed every line. Her signature appeared on vendor agreements. Her messages discussed enforcement. Her recorded call pressured Margaret to settle quickly. Her statement that every owner had been notified before recording conflicted with preserved envelopes. And after the special meeting, she had been captured saying that old files had been found before anyone publicly mentioned them. The recovered likelihood to contest column became one of the most damaging pieces of context. Karen's defenders initially argued that it could simply reflect a standard collections estimate. But when investigators compared the ratings with owner characteristics and internal communications, the pattern required explanation. Long-term owners, people who rarely attended meetings, and older residents repeatedly appeared among the lowest expected resistance scores. Margaret learned about that column from her attorney. She sat at her kitchen table with Ethan when she heard that her own account had been marked low. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she gave a small, humorless laugh. "They were right," she said. Ethan looked at her. "I didn't fight," Margaret continued. "I paid them. You didn't know there were 46 other people. That's the point." She tapped the old cardboard box beside her chair. "They counted on each of us thinking we were alone." Months passed before the property corrections, repayment demands, audits, and legal proceedings settled into something that resembled closure. Some matters moved faster than others. The owners learned that justice stories feel clean only when told backward. Living through them meant waiting for certified copies, answering letters, reviewing statements, and sometimes discovering that the next step was simply another scheduled hearing. Still, results accumulated. Unsupported liens were challenged and cleared through the appropriate processes. Corrected records replaced misleading ones. Owners who had paid documented settlements were able to pursue recovery. Pine Ridge adopted new controls requiring individual board review for liens, proof of owner notice, preservation of supporting documents, and independent verification before sensitive filings could be transmitted. No outside vendor could create enforcement authority merely because a board packet used broad language. Margaret eventually received written confirmation that the cloud over her title had been resolved. She opened the letter at her dining room table. For years, official-looking envelopes had made her stomach tighten before she knew what was inside. This time she read the page twice, then walked to the hall closet and brought out the cardboard box. She did not put the new letter into it. Instead, she removed the old notices one by one. At a later Pine Ridge meeting, a newly seated director asked Margaret why she had saved every envelope in the first place. "Because paper is what they used against us," she said. "Paper is what proved it." No one applauded immediately. The sentence was too close to what many people in the room had experienced. Then someone in the back began clapping, and others followed. Not because Margaret had delivered a speech, but because a woman who had once been afraid to tell her own daughter about a lien was now speaking into the same microphone Karen had used to control the room. Cedar Ridge returned to ordinary life sooner than Pine Ridge did. The family who bought Ethan's eastern parcel began clearing a site for their house. Survey stakes marked the new boundary. A contractor cut a temporary drive from the county road. 2 horses appeared in the pasture before the house was even finished. One cool morning, Ethan stood beside the fence, watching them move through the grass. The scene would have meant nothing to anyone passing by. To him, it represented something Karen had nearly taken without ever owning the land, the right to decide what happened to it. Margaret visited that afternoon carrying the confirmation letter. She held it up before she even reached the porch. "I opened this one without making coffee first," she said. Ethan smiled. "That's progress." They sat outside while trucks moved quietly on the distant parcel. Margaret asked whether Ethan regretted selling after everything that had happened. "No," he said. "That was the point. I wanted to sell it before Karen got involved, and I still wanted to sell it after. If I changed my decision because of her, she'd still be deciding for me." Pine Ridge did not become perfect. Residents still argued over budgets, landscaping, parking, and rules. Board meetings still ran too long. People still disagreed about assessments, but the machinery changed. A lien could no longer move from a vague agenda item to a recorded instrument without supporting records. Proof of notice had to exist before enforcement advanced. Vendor work had to be matched to actual authority. Sensitive documents required more than one person's control. The system became slower. For once, everyone considered that an improvement. Ethan kept the first certified copy of his lien in the ranch office. Months later, he took it out again and examined the page that had started everything. It still looked convincing. Official header, parcel number, legal description, assessment language, notary block, signature, county recording stamp. Nothing about its appearance warned an ordinary homeowner that something might be wrong. That was why the scheme had worked as long as it did. The victims had not been foolish. They had been shown documents designed to look like the end of an argument. Most people do not see a recording stamp and think, maybe the signature was copied from an old permit. They do not read a notary block and wonder whether the notary was in another state. They do not receive a foreclosure warning and immediately compare its postmark with the county recording date. They assume the system checked those things before the paper reached them. Karen did not need to own Margaret's house to control her for 48 hours. She only needed Margaret to believe the system had already decided against her. That belief disappeared when people began comparing records. A title examiner checked one more line. A widow kept an envelope. A former employee preserved an email. A treasurer finally opened the minutes instead of approving another summary. 47 homeowners learned their private shame was actually a shared pattern. And Ethan, who could have walked away as soon as his closing was saved, stayed long enough to help make sure the record was corrected for people whose names had once been nothing more than rows on a spreadsheet. The change was visible in smaller ways, too. Residents began bringing questions to meetings before deadlines instead of after them. New board members asked for source documents when a summary mentioned collections. Families who had once hidden notices from one another started comparing them. Claire returned to Westbridge's Norslode, but she kept a copy of the pattern chart as a training example for younger examiners. Never assume a recorded instrument is correct simply because it is recorded. Robert remained on the board long enough to help transfer financial controls, then declined another term. Margaret began attending meetings with her daughter, not because she enjoyed HOA politics, but because silence no longer felt safer. Ethan rarely attended unless a boundary or road issue touched the ranch. He had never wanted a crusade. He wanted the same thing he had wanted before Karen's lien appeared: clear lines, honest records, and the freedom to make decisions about his land without someone manufacturing authority that did not exist. The investigation had made one lesson unavoidable. Systems become dangerous when people are trained to treat questions as disobedience. Late one evening, Ethan walked the fence line where the ranch met the new parcel. The fresh survey markers were bright against the grass. He stopped beside one, looked across the field, and thought about how small the original dispute had seemed. One lien, one sale, one HOA president claiming authority over land outside her boundary. The real boundary had never been the fence. It was the point where people stopped asking for the original document. Ethan folded the old certified lien, returned it to its file, and closed the ranch gate behind him. A stamp can make a lie look like law. But once people start checking the signature, the date, the envelope, and the names behind it, the power of that lie lasts only until the next page.